All right, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of this week's content, let's rewind a second. Last week was all about, well, building the toolkit to manage risks on defence estate projects, right?
Exactly. We introduced the 8 risk categories outlined under the DIPRAC framework. That's Defence Infrastructure Project Risk and Contingency, and how they guide contingency planning for things like environmental, technical, and stakeholder risks.
Yeah, that's the one. It's like this big old checklist that asks, what's going to trip you up on your defence project? And it helps you figure out how to deal with it.
More or less. But it's also about prioritising those risks in a structured way, especially during the early planning stages. That's what last week really highlighted: get ahead of the issues before they affect scope, budget, or timelines.
Totally. And I got to say, the examples we talked about, like planning for environmental approvals or budgeting for inevitable delays, they really drive home how crucial this framework is.
Right, and that's why this week we're taking it a step further. Over the next 4 lessons, we'll go deeper into those DIPRAC risk categories. First up, tackling geographic and environmental risks. There's a lot to uncover about how location-specific challenges and sensitive environments shape defence projects.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Where you build and what's around it, that's like mission critical. Let's not get too far ahead, though. I'm pumped to unpack the whole thing. All right, so let's dive into it. Like we were saying, where you build is absolutely key. Picture this. You're in the outback of Northern Australia, 100 kilometres from the nearest town. Everything, and I mean everything, that you need for a project has to travel out to you. One dodgy dirt road, weather that's either scorching or flooding you out. It's like nature's throwing challenges at you just to see if you're paying attention.
And that's where remoteness kicks in as one of the defining risks in defence infrastructure. You've got potential delays from transport, higher costs for fuel and materials, and the safety concerns of getting personnel in and out of isolated sites. It really is a logistical mountain to climb.
And climb it we do. But let's talk practicalities, Jessica. How exactly do planners prep for something like that?
Well, a structured approach is essential. This is where tools like FeeMaster really come into play. They help planners account for these location risks up front, for example, by flagging the need to budget for fly-in, fly-out arrangements, extra fuel stores, or even makeshift on-site camps if a site is super remote.
Right. It sounds like a lifesaver for keeping a project on track in the sticks. But what happens when weather turns against you? Like those flash floods in the middle of Queensland's wet season?
Exactly. Weather compounds logistical challenges. Take the example of a project team that planned ahead for seasonal flooding in Northern Australia. They stockpiled critical materials and even secured alternate transport options like helicopters for emergencies. When the main access road became impassable, it didn't grind everything to a halt because they'd factored contingency into their plan. Instead, they continued working without major setbacks.
Oh, that's smart. Expecting a curveball so you're prepped before it even happens. And the cost of not prepping?
It can be catastrophic, not just in terms of budget blowouts, but operational delays. Imagine defence capabilities impacted because supplies didn't arrive on time. That's why proactive planning is critical, especially in locations prone to extreme climates or restricted access.
Yeah, it's all about working with what the land throws your way, huh? And speaking of proactive, I bet there's even more to managing this complex risk web. Let's keep it rolling. Alright, so we've talked about tackling those logistical and weather challenges up front. But here's another curveball: the ground you're building on. Ever considered what might be hiding below? Sometimes it's not what you expect, and that can flip your whole plan on its head.
Exactly. Managing defence projects isn't just about putting structures on land, it's also about ensuring you don't harm the environment or disrupt cultural heritage. That's not just good practice, it's the law, particularly under the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act.
Yeah. That's the one that makes sure you're not flattening bushland or building over sacred spots, right?
More or less. The EPBC Act protects critical environmental and heritage aspects like endangered species, ecosystems, historical features, or Indigenous cultural sites. Ignoring it can lead to heavy penalties, public backlash, or worse, your project grinding to a halt. Okay,
so picture this. You're halfway through digging, you hit, let's say, ancient artifacts. What now?
That's why early environmental impact assessments, or EIAs, are vital. A thorough EIA will identify risks like that before a shovel hits the ground. For example, defence projects often work with traditional custodians to survey sites, particularly for unknown Indigenous heritage areas. You adjust your layout or preserve specific zones if needed.
And if it's not an artefact, maybe it's unexploded ordnance, UXO, right?
Exactly, and UXO is no small concern. Defence sites often have a history of live-fire exercises, so there could be leftovers underground. Ignoring UXO not only puts lives at risk, but also construction timelines. That's why many defence projects integrate UXO clearance as part of geotechnical surveys. Specialist teams scan, clear, and certify the area before work begins.
Oh, and I bet that's no quick or cheap process.
It's definitely an investment up front, but compare that to a scenario where UXO is uncovered during excavation. The entire site could shut down for weeks while an explosives team sorts it out, costing far more in delays.
All right, point taken. But what about people pushing back? Stakeholders who've got concerns, locals, regulators.
Early engagement is key. Take a defence project I worked on in a sensitive wetland area. We brought in local councils, environmental groups, even traditional owners right from the start. By addressing their concerns early, things like habitat protection or heritage preservation, we avoided major resistance. When it came time for approvals, support was already in place.
Let me guess. That saved a ton of headaches down the road.
Absolutely. Early consultation can smooth the entire process, from getting permits approved faster to building trust with the community.
All right, so the motto here is clear. Plan for the land under your feet, what you can't see, and everyone who'll have a say in it. Let's keep going. All right, so we just talked about the importance of planning for the land and bringing people on board early. Now picture yourself leading a defence project. You've got extreme weather, endangered species, tight deadlines, and a local community watching your every move. It's like juggling flaming swords. Where do you even start?
You start with a framework, and for defence projects, that's the DIPRAC framework. It's designed to identify risks systematically across critical categories like location, environmental, and stakeholder risks. Think of it as your project risk safety net.
Got it. Spot your risks before they spot you. But how detailed are we talking?
Very detailed. For example, in environmental risk planning, it forces you to think about everything, from weather impacts to sensitive ecological zones, heritage areas, and contamination risks. It's about being thorough so nothing gets overlooked when projects move to execution.
All right, so let's say you've nailed down the risks. Yay, framework. But then comes the tricky part. People, stakeholders. How do you manage, say, a local community that's skeptical about what you're building?
It's all about collaboration. One of the best examples I've seen was a project in the tropics, incredibly sensitive wetland area. Early on, the project team engaged traditional owners, local conservation groups, and councils. They brought them to the table, explained everything, and even adjusted the design to protect critical habitats. By doing this, they built trust up front and avoided major opposition later.
Right. Getting buy-in instead of, marching in and causing chaos. And what about cases where communities do push back?
That's where proactive planning truly matters. If you've done your homework, early impact assessments, stakeholder consultations, and risk workshops for extreme weather planning, you're not backtracking. You're showing that the environment and community matter as much as the infrastructure itself.
So, not just sustainable buildings, but sustainable relationships too. I like it. And these frameworks don't just help dodge headaches, they also streamline stuff, right?
Exactly. When you integrate these risk mitigations early, like building extreme weather contingencies or planning with environmental approvals in mind, you don't just avoid disaster. You gain efficiencies by not having to react to unplanned events. It's smarter, leaner project delivery.
All right, I'm sold. Frameworks and early collaboration. They're basically your golden ticket to keeping defence projects sharp and aligned. So, just to sum up, planning early, using frameworks like DIPRAC, and involving stakeholders deeply can really make or break a defence project. Now, before we wrap up this episode, we've got a couple of quick reminders to throw your way. And listen up, these are important.
Yes, first, don't forget to complete the quiz on this week's lesson webpage. It's designed to test your understanding and help cement what we've covered.
Absolutely. And I mean, quizzes can be fun, right? Plus, it's a great way to see if all this defence risk stuff is actually sticking.
And next, take some time this week to reflect on one of your company's past defence projects or proposals. Look at the outcomes, identify any geographic or environmental risks, and discuss your findings in the course forums. It's a valuable exercise to share insights with your peers.
Oh yeah, nothing beats a little compare and contrast action. You might even pick up some insider tips from someone else's experience.
Exactly. And while you're doing all that productive reflection, we'd love to hear from you. If you've got feedback on the podcast or the lessons, just hit reply to the latest course email and let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, seriously, we read those. Doesn't matter if it's a quick, hey, loving this, or a detailed critique. Fire it our way. It really helps us keep improving.
And if you've been enjoying the podcast and the course material, we'd be thrilled if you'd recommend it to your friends or colleagues who might find it useful.
Absolutely. Spread the love. Word of mouth is how good ideas grow, right?
Right. So with those reminders out of the way, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay proactive and keep those defence projects on track.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Take care, everyone. Catch you next episode.